The US Senate votes to end all support for the Saudi-UAE coalition fighting in Yemen and blames the Saudi Crown Prince for the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. But will President Donald Trump veto the measure? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Imran Kahn. The US Senate has voted to end all military support to the Saudi-UAE coalition that's been fighting in Yemen since 2015. A second resolution blamed Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman for the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. If these measures pass the House of Representatives, they're likely to be vetoed by the President. We'll bring in our guests in a moment, but first, Rosalind Jordan reports from Capitol Hill.
See none. The results are 56 yeas and 41 nays. The resolution is agreed to as amended.
A rebuke of U.S. President Donald Trump's policy to stand by Saudi Arabia no matter what. The U.S. Senate has passed a resolution symbolically ending all U.S. military support for Saudi and Emirati forces fighting in the Yemeni civil war.
The war in Yemen is unauthorized. There has never been a vote in Congress to allow our men and women to participate in that war, and therefore that war is unconstitutional.
I have also been deeply concerned that the President continues to ignore human rights violations, the suppression of dissent, and the deaths of thousands of civilians in Yemen in order to maintain good relations with the Saudis.
Legislators have been worried for some time about the civilian suffering in Yemen, but the Saudi government's murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi in October set off a wave of anger, bipartisan anger, not seen on Capitol Hill in some time. Legislators have demanded and received closed-door briefings from the CIA director and the secretaries of State and Defense.
I can't mention some of the things that they have told us yesterday and today. But I do think that this horrific killing of this journalist is not something that we can just simply look the other way and say, hey, what are you going to do? You know, this is war and these things happen. These things shouldn't happen. And we have to be very pointed about it.
Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman.
And they've also passed a second resolution that says, quote, the Senate believes Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is responsible for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. It calls on Saudi Arabia both to, quote, ensure accountability for his murder and to release political prisoners. And for good measure, it also condemns Iran's giving of advanced lethal weapons to Houthi rebels. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell says this resolution strikes the right balance between accountability and maintaining alliances, unlike other pending measures.
Their resolution is neither sufficiently prudent nor sufficiently precise for the job at hand. Yes, the Senate wants Saudi Arabia to act responsibly. We want to see a more stable Yemen for the sake of the Yemeni people. We also want to preserve this 70-year partnership.
Even though this session of Congress is almost over, the legislators' interest in Saudi Arabia's behavior is not. Legislators from both parties and in both the Senate and the House say that come January, they will be convening hearings and they will be conducting investigations into how the U.S. and Saudi Arabia's foreign policy goals intersect. They also want to make certain that Washington isn't underselling itself, either morally or legally. Rosalind Jordan, Al Jazeera, Capitol Hill.
Over to our panel in Washington, D.C., Fatima Alasrar, a senior analyst at the Arabia Foundation. Joining us on Skype from Stockholm, Hakim Almasmari, a political and military mediator who took part in the recent Yemen talks in Sweden, and in Essex in the UK, Natasha Lindstedt, a professor of government at the University of Essex and a specialist in authoritarian government and US politics. Welcome to you all. I'd like to begin with you, Professor Natasha Lindstedt in Essex. This seems to be a very strong message from the Senate, both on the war in Yemen and blaming the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman squarely for the killing of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Now, as we've heard earlier, it's likely that the President of the US will use his veto powers. But has the message been heard by him?
Well, I think it's sending a very clear message. It's a strong rebuke of President Trump that the Senate strongly disagrees with the way the Saudis have been waging this war in Yemen, and that they've decided that they want to stop aid of this conflict. And they're also indicating that there's going to be more to come in January, that not only are they upset with the way that the Saudis have engaged in this war, they're also putting the direct blame on the Crown Prince in his involvement of the murder of the journalist Khashoggi. And they're indicating that in January, there could be more. There could be a suspension of weapons sales, and they could be a ban on refueling. And so this is going to be a strong assertion of the War Powers Act, which is where the legislative branch is basically saying that they have a right to dictate whether or not a war will continue.
Let me bring in Fatima Alasrar here. Talking of what the US is actually doing, the US Senate is actually doing, do you think this is helpful to trying to bring about an end to the war in Yemen?
So far, the calls to end the war in Yemen hasn't really considered what the implications are on the ground. I think we need to call for peace in Yemen. That's fundamental. But we can't call for an abrupt ending to what is happening in Yemen without really having a resolution on the ground. Otherwise, the entire past 4 years would be completely folly. So we need to think justly about the people. We need to think justly about all parties to the conflict. There has been sacrifices from many independent Yemeni citizens, and there has been a huge humanitarian crisis, a lot of suffering, and we ought to find a way to, find a real resolution, restore governance, restore, government institutions, and not just abruptly withdraw without necessarily finding any alternate ways. What the Senate War Powers Act is just that. It's a War Powers Act. It just puts the decision back in Congress' hands. It doesn't want the administration to act. So if I think about what are the implications for Yemen, it's really not about Yemen. I think Yemen has just been used as, an example to say, this could happen when the president acts with all authority, and this is why you need to put things back in the hands of Congress, because we could better scrutinize, such engagement. But that's not sufficient to solve what's going on in Yemen. Unfortunately, a lot of congressmen, senators have been somewhat using the humanitarian crisis to point to the suffering of people as something that only the Saudi-led coalition is responsible to, completely ignoring Houthi violations on the ground. I think for Yemen, this doesn't really send a comforting message, but overall, it will not have a huge impact, I would say.
Hakim Almasmari, it's not going to have a huge impact, says our guest in Washington, D.C. What are your thoughts?
I agree. And also, it's a bit too late. 4 years later, the U.S. government suddenly clicks in and says this war is violating U.S. law. Even if this does pass, it could take months in the best case scenario. And I'm very doubtful that it will pass. It's very sad that what's happening in Yemen is being made by so many international countries being involved in this war, and for years have seen the suffering of millions of Yemenis. And when Yemen becomes the worst humanitarian crisis in a century, then everyone starts clicking and saying, "Hey, Yemen is in need of help," forgetting that war was the reason that this poor country, became a catastrophe. So I'm not optimistic that anything in Senate will that directly affect Yemen. It will put more pressure on Saudi Arabia, yes, but it will not help end the sufferings of Yemenis or ease the humanitarian situation that the country is facing today.
Now, you were in the recent talks in Sweden, where this ceasefire deal was agreed over the port of Hodeidah. Now, things like that, is that what's more crucially needed rather than these, like you're almost saying it's an empty gesture by the US Senate? Do we need more of that kind of thing?
What happened in Sweden it was no political deal whatsoever. It was more linked to humanitarian reasons. Even Hodeidah, yes, there will not be clashes or the calls for the end of clashes in the Hodeidah province, but again, for humanitarian reasons and not for any political gains. So no side is losing when it comes to Hodeidah being solved. Each one is just easing the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. Other issues linked to humanitarian problems are still standing right now. The closure of Sana'a airport, it's been closed for 2.5 years right now. So all the things that happened in Sweden, all the updates, all the progress has been linked to humanitarian success and or easing the pressure on the international community and on Saudi-led coalition in specific, how to ease this crisis while not solving anything politically or finding a final solution for Yemen.
Fatima Abu Alasrar, I see you nodding your head in agreement, but surely there has to be a start point to these talks. There has to be something.
There has to be something, but I think what Hakim is talking about is it's something, but it's not the overall picture. It's somewhat of a fragile agreement as well. So there is, more than one reason to be skeptical about how this is going to affect on the long term. Is this actually going to bring peace? Right now, everybody is sighing a sigh of relief because they think that, with the ceasefire, you're really sparing the lives of the troops. I know people who are fighting on the government side, and they're extremely ecstatic that they, that there could be some type of agreement on Hodeidah, but they're also skeptical that this agreement could last or that it could be implemented. Right now, I think because of the signing, because of the high-level attendance and the international attention that this event has achieved, there's just a lot of feelings of positivity, but I think that's really, truly over-exaggerated. The devil is in the details. The implementation of these agreements is not going to be easy. Something even as simple as prisoners exchange has a lot of sticking points that need to be solved. There are already chatter out that says that the majority of, or half, or the majority of the prisoners that the Houthis asked for were basically killed in battle because there were, and some of them are prisoners of war. So how would the Houthis really react to that? Does the government have all the details of those who were killed in battle? Can it send their remains? At the same time, in terms of the prisoners that the government of Yemen has asked for, the majority of which, over 8,000 prisoners, are prisoners of conscience. They're political activists, they're academics, they're journalists, they're women, they're children. And these prisoners, if they are released, they probably would want to stay home with their families in Houthi territory. There are no guarantees that they cannot be imprisoned again. And then the realities on the ground are somewhat disconnected because just 2 days ago, while people were talking about the agreements, there were more reports of abductions, illegal abductions, that the Houthi militia have conducted on various civilians, and these were deemed unjust. So working out these details, implementing a true ceasefire, making sure that violations are not, happening on the ground, making sure that there is, effective deployment of neutral or independent troops on the ground to enforce the peace. This is all, I don't think it can actually materialize in the few weeks that have been proposed. So I think the agreement is slightly fragile.
Professor Natasha Lindstadt, let me bring you in here. It seems that the White House has certainly thrown its lot in with Saudi Arabia and is backing certainly the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman. But the Senate, there seems to be a lot of anger there towards that move by the White House. What can the Senate do to try and strengthen the agreements, things like that, the ceasefire agreements within Stockholm and places like that? What can the Senate actually do? Can it do anything?
Well, I mean, I think I tend to agree with the panelists that the U.S. involvement in the conflict has really only exacerbated the conflict by supporting the Saudis in such a very visible way with, providing them with weapons and fueling and training and intelligence. And this has helped to just prolong the conflict and make it more deadly. You've seen, though, in the past months, the Senate has become, and the House has become more and more critical of the way the Saudis are waging the war, and even trying to delay the sale of precision-guided munitions because they were worried that the civilian death toll was just way too high and that the Saudis were largely responsible for this. But in terms of what the Senate can actually do, it's what already has been said. They have made it clear that in January, they can try to ban the sale of, or at least suspend the sale of weapons to Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia is one of the biggest importers. It is the biggest importer of weapons in the world. And the U.S. is one of the biggest exporters to Saudi Arabia. And then it can also try to ban refueling. It will only affect the way that the Saudis can wage the conflict to some extent. Will it be able to impact the outcome of the war in Yemen and more effectively deal with the humanitarian crisis? And deal with trying to come up with some sort of peace agreement? Probably not. But we can't underestimate the importance of the steps that we're taking. It's important because the Saudi-U.S. relationship has been one where the U.S. has never rebuked Saudi Arabia. There's been almost no criticism of Saudi Arabia. And so this actually is more significant than it may appear to be, simply because they're trying to send a clear message that they do not agree with the way the Saudis are conducting the war. Though we can be pessimistic or cynical about, well, that really isn't going to affect the outcome.
Hakim Almasmari, if the US then can't do it, and the United Nations are trying their hardest, but there's a long way to go, is there any other partner, any other honest peace broker that may be able to significantly change the outcome of the war in Yemen and bring about an end to it?
Well, the U.S. can help stop the war. The idea is not to have Congress and Senate vote for it, and the U.S. just steps aside, and forgetting that it's one of the reasons why this war is happening in the first place, or a reason that it was prolonged. So the idea is not for the U.S. to have a vote and, hey, I'm done with, bye-bye. It's to put pressure on Saudi Arabia, which the U.S. can do, put pressure on Saudi Arabia to ease its attacks on Yemen, to come to a peace deal, to end the siege on Yemen, to end the war even if possible. But that's what's needed from the U.S., not just a vote that will get the U.S. out of the picture and keep the results in Yemen as is, because Saudi could easily just find other partners. So what the mess that the U.S. Was involved in has to be cleaned up, whether today or tomorrow. So the U.S. can do it, but it's the will. Do they have the will to do it, or does their interests, financial gains, are they greater than the lives of the innocent civilians that are being killed? Are they more valuable than the millions who are suffering in poverty and hunger? This is where the values of the U.S. Would be clear.
Fatima Abu Alasrar, we have seen now that the US is very definitely supporting, certainly the White House is very definitely supporting Saudi Arabia. The Senate and the White House seem to be putting sanctions on Iran. Iran clearly a key player in the Yemeni conflict. Where's Iran in all of this? Is there any other way of pressuring them?
Iran has been trying to maintain some plausible deniability in terms of its relationship with the Houthis. So despite all evidence that points to its support to the militia. They try to say, listen, we don't have any, control over the militia. They can do whatever they want. But this is not, what we know from past agreements that were not signed, that were not committed to by the militia. I think they have completely helped Iran strengthen its foothold in Sana'a. I think they're giving Iran a lot of assurances, and this should be a sign of concern. Whether the U.S. can pressure Iran or the Houthis, I think the U.S. has no leverage over both. The relationship is not at its best. And unfortunately, I think during the Obama administration, Yemen was perhaps an appeasement for Iran. So and also it's sort of like an appeasement for both Iran and Saudi Arabia. So there are many. I think there are many problems here in terms of holding Iran accountable. I don't think that's going to happen easily. But what is really needed is sustained international pressure to stop Iran from funding the Houthi militia, from and perhaps influence the Houthis to give up some of their very destructive rhetoric. I mean, I think it was a real win for the Houthis in the Senate when senators do not necessarily understand that the Houthis' main chant is death to America, and here they are passing resolutions that could somehow benefit and empower Iran-backed Houthis. So there is sort of like there are some layers of fogginess about the local context, about what's going on in terms of Iran's support to Yemen that the Houthis are really taking advantage of, and that Iran is taking advantage of, and because Saudi Arabia is using conventional powers, and because it's buying weapons from the United States, that gets attention and not the other issue. So in here, there's somewhat an imbalance. What would be reassuring is for the Senate to pay attention to all aspects of what's going on in Yemen. Again, the humanitarian crisis and also the human rights and the other violations that are happening.
We are running out of time, but I would just like to bring in Professor Natasha Lindstadt here. The other resolution that was passed unanimously by the US Senate was blaming the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman for the murder of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Does that have any teeth? Does that have any bite? What does that actually mean?
No, I don't think it does have any teeth or bite. It is significant in that you have, as I said, the Senate sending a clear message to the Saudi regime that they are unhappy with it. But I actually also don't think that the U.S. has that much power over Saudi Arabia. I do think that the way that this recent resolution will affect the way that the Saudis can wage war in Yemen, and that may hamper its abilities to wage the war in the way that they want to. But I don't see Saudi Arabia as totally dependent on the U.S. I think it's a very autonomous actor that has links to all kinds of countries and has trade deals with all kinds of countries, and it does what it wants to do when it wants to do it. The message, though, that they're trying to send is that, but there were other countries also sending this message as well, that they were very unhappy with the way the Crown Prince conducted himself and with the fact that he's been implicated in a murder. They had to. I mean, they think that there was really no other way out with that than to just sit there and do nothing. But I don't see it affecting the Crown Prince and the ruling family at this particular moment.
Well, we are out of time now. I would like to thank all our guests, Fatima Alasrar, Hakim Almasmari and Natasha Lindstadt. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the entire team here in Doha, bye for now.